According to the IDF, over 100 Israeli soldiers have been killed since Israel invaded Gaza in late October, with nearly 600 wounded. To put that in context, in 2014, when Israel last invaded Gaza, just 67 soldiers were killed in around the same time frame. And yet, it isn't clear that Israel is making much progress in its goal of eliminating Hamas. According to the IDF, 5,000 Hamas members have been killed, but the basis of that figure is far from clear, especially when many Israeli officials have claimed that everyone in Gaza is Hamas. So we don't know how they are making this calculation. Former Israeli negotiator Daniel Levy and journalist Tony Karan have written this article for US magazine The Nation. They argue that Israel is losing the war and failing to achieve its political goals. That's despite killing over 18,000 Palestinians. So, with both civilian and military morale lagging and international condemnation of Israel's actions on the rise, what the IDF needed was an impressive win, which perhaps explains footage that emerged last week of IDF troops taking a large number of Palestinian men prisoner in northern Gaza. The men were stripped almost naked and forced to sit in the street. It's not known who shot the video, but they were shown on an Israeli news channel last Thursday. In another video, the men appeared to be handing over weapons to their captors. In this footage, the men are being held at gunpoint with their arms in the air. The location of the film has been confirmed as outside the UN-run Khalifa school in Beit Lahiya, north of Gaza City. In their hands, the men hold up their ID cards. Then one man emerges from the crowd as an Israeli soldier orders him forward. He appears to be carrying an automatic weapon in his left hand and what looks like a cartridge in his right, and he places them both in a pile of other weapons. Now, Israel described the video as showing Hamas fighters who had surrendered to its military. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said of the scene, quote, "They are laying down their weapons and handing themselves over to our heroic fighters." But Palestinians were skeptical, noting that amongst those captured was a recognizable journalist. And the situation got even more confusing when a second video emerged. In this video, the same man as in the previous one emerges from the crowd of captive men, except this time the automatic weapon is in his right hand. Remember, it was in his left hand in the last clip. And what appears to be a cartridge is in his left hand rather than his right hand as it was in the first video. Again, he adds both to a pile of weapons. The two videos led to claims that the surrender of arms by the captive men was staged, with the IDF filming separate shots of the same event. BBC Verify has now investigated those claims. It says it's established that the two different scenes come from a continuous sequence with the same man going back and forth to hand over 3 weapons in total. Of course, that doesn't make the video any less dodgy. The men have been stripped to their underwear, but somehow still have at least 3 large guns on them. That doesn't make any sense. And the same man is being ordered back and forth at gunpoint, hardly the sign of a convincing surrender. Others have also reported that the man bringing out the gun is the owner of an aluminium workshop in Gaza City, who with hundreds of others had fled to the school to seek shelter. Another Palestinian man who spoke to the BBC identified his cousins amongst the captured. The BBC reported this. The man, who wishes to remain anonymous over safety concerns, told BBC Arabic's Efar Shalabi that IDF soldiers entered the area and used megaphones to order the men from their homes and UN relief agency schools. The IDF ordered women in the area to go to a nearby hospital and later threatened to shoot them if the men did not come out of their homes, he said. The man said 7 of his cousins have since been released and have returned home, but added he does not know about the fate of the 3 who remain in Israeli detention. That account also accords with testimony other Palestinians have given about their treatment at the hands of the IDF. This next video is from Al Jazeera. The men speaking were all taken captive by the IDF.
خش على دارنا قلنا لهم احنا مدنيين صاروا يفجروا في الدار ويطخوا مش عارفين ايش يعملوا بعدين اخذونا قالوا لنا نطلع واحد عريان اخذونا على دار مش عارف وين الحريم اخذوهم على جنب على جهه ثانيه مش عارفين عنهم اي حاجه امياتنا وخواتنا اخذونا حجزونا في دار كسرونا تكسير واحد بيتكلم بخبطه برجله وبخبطه كفوف وبخبطه وهيك حكينا له بدنا ميه حكينا فيش ميه فيش حاجه طب بدنا نروح الحمام اعملها حالك وفي ولد والله اعملها حاله قدامي
One man told Al Jazeera about what sounds like a mock execution carried out by the IDF.
يوم الشباب قاعدين رفعوا منهم منهم 20 انت قوم انت قوم انت قوم لقوا 20 واحد موقع الدبابات اوطى من الحاصل اللي قاعدين فيها مع التجريف دبوا صاروا يدبوا ايش؟ الشباب دب والدبابات اقبالها مجرفات محمله رمل انا اقول دفنوا الشباب وحياة الله دفنوهم خلاص استشهدوا يا شباب استشهدوا صاروا ايش يصرخوا الشباب 5 دقائق 10 دقائق بعدين ما سمعش لهم صوت يقول خلاص قتلوهم بعد شويه لهم طالعين ايش المهنيين.
Human rights group Euro-Mediterranean Monitor have now called for an international investigation into Israel's treatment of Palestinian captives. They report this. The Euromed Monitor team has gathered statements and testimonies about Israeli special forces raiding refugee centers in Gaza City and its northern areas, which housed thousands of displaced Palestinians. These raids have involved the execution of young men who were shot with live ammunition at point-blank range. Displaced people at the Cairo school, which houses hundreds of displaced people west of Gaza City, told Euromed Monitor's team that several civilian cars carrying Israeli special forces stormed the schoolyard on Friday, the 8th of December, killing and wounding a number of unarmed young men. According to the testimonies, the Israeli special forces ordered all of the men in the school to quickly gather and line up opposite them. 4 of the men were executed and the others were arrested after a brief interrogation. So that report from Euromed Monitor, I mean, that's war crime after war crime, isn't it? Israel's rounding up and stripping of dozens of Palestinian men is, at the very least, systematic humiliation. But for Israel, it's all justified. This was Israeli government advisor Mark Regev on Sky News.
The International Red Cross saying that all those detained should be treated with humanity and dignity. Doesn't look particularly humane or dignified, does it?
So I understand the pictures look terrible, but you have to understand why we asked these men to take off their shirts. Hamas is one of the people who invented the idea of the suicide bomber with the dynamite tied to his body. And of course, when taking prisoners, we are asking people to take off their shirts because we don't want a situation where a Hamas terrorist raises his hands supposedly to surrender and then detonates himself and kills our people. So this is a natural precaution, a logical precaution, and now we're making sure there's a new thing to make sure that there'll be for Palestinian Hamas prisoners, that there'll be clothing available for them once they have been checked. But the initial stage where they'll have to take off their shirts, we don't want suicide vests being exploded with our people around.
As we saw, more than their shirts had to be taken off. Several of the men were identified as civilians, including a journalist. What would you say to them? Many of them have now been released, of course, without any charge.
Exactly, Kay. When people have been rounded up in areas of combat, men of military age, and after an investigation, if they are shown to be not involved in Hamas, they are released. We don't see the civilian population of Gaza as a target of our operation. We're out there to get Hamas. And I think so far the majority of people we have arrested have been associated with Hamas, and therefore we want to interrogate them. We can get vital information, also information about where our hostages are from these people. But of course, if you're not involved, people are released, and as you've reported, they've been released quickly.
This is a really strange story, this. So it seems to me the sequence of events was that Israel and the IDF were concerned that they were taking lots of flack internationally because of the fact that they were just killing loads and loads of women and children, and not really any Hamas fighters. And so to push back against this, and I suppose maybe to try and demotivate Palestinians as well, they sort of said, okay, well, let's release lots of pictures of men, and then it will seem as if we are rounding up Hamas and that this is a military success. They sort of showed that to the world, and then the world was like, why have you got all of these men stripped naked, sort of sitting on the floor, and why are you filming them? And then they say, yes, okay, we needed to check they didn't have suicide vests on. Well, why are you filming them and then releasing that to the world? Why are you lining them up in front of this hole you seem to have dug in the desert, right? The rest of the world was like, this doesn't make any sense. And then the Israelis are sort of like, oh, God, okay, so maybe it does also matter how we treat the men. I feel like, David, that Israel had sort of thought, oh, well, everyone's complaining about women and kids. That means men are fair game. Let's release lots of images of us being cruel to men. And then people will say, oh, actually, maybe, yeah, this military campaign is a success and they're doing the right thing. and it's backfired. I don't know. Is that do you have the same interpretation of what we've seen over the past few days? This sort of sequence of events.
There was one piece that you missed in the coverage of those kids who were talking about their detention, which is that the Israeli government put numbers on them in order to label them as Palestinian prisoners, a tactic that we've seen earlier in the wake of the October 7th attacks, when they were putting like cattle, kind of cable ties around the arms, the wrists and the ankles of Palestinian prisoners of war that were taken, many of them simply just Gazan laborers. And, last time I was on the show, Michael, I spoke kind of a bit about my own background and my own kind of personal relationship with this stuff. And, a lot of this footage just leaves me heartbroken and speechless to see the exact same acts of dehumanization, of oppression, of violence be committed by people who dare to speak in the name and the legacy of those crimes that were committed to us. And, I think I get really concerned, so I don't want to sound like a broken record. I get really concerned with, we watched the clip from Sky, the kind of self-congratulations of a journalist who really puts Mark Regev to task, who really asks these hard questions, because I just don't know what more do we have to see? What more do we have to know? We're so far behind on any mechanism of accountability, let alone justice, for the people of Palestine in the present unfolding Gaza genocide. I just don't. Sometimes I wake up so dispirited in looking. Of course, it's easy to be dispirited here in Washington, D.C., the kind of epicenter of this particular monstrosity in many ways. But, I just think that we're seeing these crimes unfold day after day, and we're losing ourselves in these complex strings of lies and verifications of checking this or that photo and losing sight of the broader plot. I mean, this is a genocide. Textbook written, declared by the highest officials of the UN system, having to invoke articles that have not been seen at the level of the UN in decades, in order to just draw down to the most basic fundamentals of a peaceful settlement, which is a ceasefire. And I just get so concerned when we spend a whole cycle of Twitter rage and reflection on one particular lie or one particular photo, one particular atrocity, when we're missing in that obsession with a tree, a forest that is completely visible to us and has, of course, been for so many decades, but has only become in sharper focus in the course of the past 2 months. And we're approaching the holidays. We're approaching it's Hanukkah now. We're approaching Christmas. The New Year is coming up soon. And again, I'm very, very scared. I'm scared that people will stop paying attention. I'm scared that people will maybe switch on their phones to check on the latest controversy, the latest lie that's being exposed, the latest photo that's been published, and not apply the same pressure that needs to be applied 2 months ago to avert what could be not just 2, but as you said in this program many times, a year more of this systematic humiliation, dispossession, and outright killing of Palestinian citizens. And so this is a kind of critical kind of inflection point. I think we're at 2 months in, approaching these holidays, where we either change the rules of our reflection, change the rules, adapt our capacity to hold our attention and to hold the pain of our Palestinian sisters and brothers, to push our politicians to not just make rhetorical declarations that might nudge in this way or that, but actually make substantial moves to dismantle that, or to sever those arteries of complicity, as I've emphasized so many times before. And I just think about this poor kid with, a number written on his arm, held for no crime at all in an Israeli prison. And the idea that Mark Regev saying, we're letting them out of prison. Come on, we're not targeting civilians, rounding up innocent people, humiliating them, beating them, stripping them of their basic dignity and humanity just to release them later on, and saying that's totally fine, let alone the deaths, as you mentioned, Michael, of women and children. I mean, this is all, it's not adding up to a story that's any different than the one that we've been telling for the past 2 months. This is a genocide. And in order to avert, an even more sustained process of ethnic cleansing and dispossession, we have to act now and not wake up and read with a kind of twisted delight the latest headline that may occupy us for 6-7 hours on Twitter.